we all know that China grew very rapidly at almost double-digit GDP growth rate per annum over a 40-year period from 1980 to 2020. And it became the second largest economy in the world, second only to the United States. China today is an $18 trillion economy. But the big question, I think, when we are trying to decipher China is to try to understand what is happening within China. So I think let's focus first on that. What's happening with the economy, because there has been a sharp slowdown in economic growth in China. And what I'd like to ask both our guests today is to decipher for us whether this slowdown is something which is very serious, whether the Chinese economy is really slowing down very fast. Will they be growing over the next 20 years at, say, a 4.5%, 4.5% GDP growth rate per annum, or will it be closer to 2.5% GDP growth rate per annum? Because the results of that will be very different for countries around the world, including India. So let me start by throwing this question to both of you. What's happening on the economic front in China? Maybe Vijay first. And
thank you. Yeah, thanks, Gautam. And it's a great pleasure to be with you, Dr. Chaulia, as well as Gautam on this panel. I think, on the surface, things look very good for China. $18 trillion economy, world's largest trading nation, world's second largest outbound investor, largest foreign exchange reserves in the world. But I think the impact of COVID and in the post-COVID situation, China is facing headwinds that it has not experienced, because between 1990 and 2015, it was a linear growth in one direction, which is that each year the economy grew by certainly by 7 to 8% and mostly in double digits. Essentially what is happening is there is a pushback from the rest of the world on the excessive exports that China is engaging in. And as a result, China needs to absorb some of that excess domestically by getting its own people to consume. The problem is that the Chinese themselves are not consuming, because the falling growth rate, which is inevitable if you are an $18 trillion economy, together with falling savings, because property prices have fallen, you would have read about it in the newspapers, essentially has led to what is called negative wealth effect, which is that you feel that the amount of money you have may not be enough for your retirement or for your old age or for other issues like health and so on. And therefore, just when the government wants you to spend, you are not spending. So what we are seeing is a situation where the government needs to get its population to consume, but the instruments that they can exercise to get the population to consume are not there, largely because the way that they finance their growth was essentially through sale of land use. Land, as you know, is not private in China, it's owned by the state. So what they were selling was not the land, but the use of that land. And it was on the use of that land that the state got massive revenues to build infrastructure, to encourage industry and so on. That's fallen because there's just that much infrastructure you can build and just that much property you can sell. So the government is stressed, it doesn't have the money to put into the economy. The population doesn't want to consume because it's not sure 20 or 30 years down the road whether the savings are going to be adequate. And the rest of the world is saying we're not going to buy so many products because you're hollowing out our industry. So in a sense, even though on the surface things look good, I think the crisis in China, economic crisis, is structural. And we need to keep an eye out because, of course, an $18 trillion economy in crisis is going to impact on all our lives as well.
Yeah, I'll echo what Vijayji just said. Well, just add a couple of points. The demographic decline is a structural factor that they have to watch out for, because fertility rates have dropped and the net replacement ratio, all these things do look quite bleak for China. So I think they have already peaked and there's no way they can restore, even with any kind of reforms or monetary or fiscal policies and adjustments. I don't think there is any way for them to climb their way back to high growth. So this new normal will stay. The other thing I wanted to highlight is the political economy of this slowdown. Under Xi Jinping, our reading is that ideology and politics and political control over what the Marxists call the factors of production, and the production processes, that has been given higher priority than allowing what they call reform and opening and markets to function. So there's a tightening of the grip of the state over the productive forces, because I think for them, they believe that slower growth is okay, but we can't let loose all these elements in the society to be free and to express themselves. So there's this expanded kind of authoritarianism or almost a totalitarianism that we are seeing today, with this clawing back of some of the freedoms that came in the pre-Xi Jinping era for the market forces. So as a result of which, they are okay with maybe 3% as long as he can continue ruling, another 10 years or 15 years, looks like, he has made it permanent for himself. So that's why some people say it is a neo-Maoist or whatever. There is more of ideology and political control now rather than growth. I think growth is no longer a priority for them, at least until it may stoke significant social unrest or revolts. We saw a bit of that during the so-called white paper revolt during the COVID crisis, where people came out with blank sheets of paper protesting against the clampdown and the controls. So I think they are now moving in that direction of excessive controls, and they cannot let go. That is the ultimate problem, because they feel like that will lead to more independent entrepreneurial activity. Even with society, with domestic consumption, they don't allow enough purchasing power and social benefits for people, because they think that will give them ideas and will take them out of the state's ambit. So a kind of the creeping shadow of the state and the authoritarianism is, I think, at the root of this, and it may be good for Xi Jinping and for the top echelons to sustain themselves in power, but in the long run, it may be sowing the seeds of decay or at least decline, and we'll see how long they can sustain this.
So let me try pinning you, both of you, down. I started by asking that over the next 7, 8, 10 years, do you think China will grow at 4.5% GDP growth per annum, or will it be closer to 2.5% GDP growth per annum? So what is your take on that? Can you venture a guess?
Yeah, well, I would think we should not underestimate China's capacity to grow. We should also acknowledge that in the news industry, China is a world leader. If you watched an interview by the Singapore Prime Minister a month ago, he said that China is world class in almost every new technology and a world leader in many of them. Today, 70% of all electric vehicles exported out sold to the world are Chinese. Practically 90% of all solar photovoltaic cells are Chinese. And China is leading in AI and quantum. So the question is not whether China does not have the capacity to generate the new economy. It has that capacity. The question is whether the huge amount of redundancy in the old economy is going to be absorbed by the new economy or not. That is the real question. And I think on that, given the fact that China has, despite all the cynicism in the world in the last 30 years, outperformed expectations, I would, as an Indian, be circumspect in assuming that China is going to collapse. I think China is ruled by a group of people who are highly educated, highly intelligent. And although there are problems in the manner in which they are running the country, as Dr. Chaulia pointed out, where ideology is beginning to influence market decisions, we should never underestimate them. So I would certainly say China will grow at 3 to 4%, at least for the next 10 to 15 years. And just as a last point I would like to make is that if we grow at 8% per annum, and they grow at 3% per annum, they will still quantitatively add more GDP every year for the next 15 years. So we have to really grow at double digits if we want to narrow that gap.
2.5 or 4.5?
Only question is about the credibility of the data. When the unemployment figures were ballooning. Youth unemployment was 25-30%. They just stopped giving out the data, So the nature of the state is still quite opaque, and the information controls have actually been increased in the Xi Jinping era. So if they even produce data of 4%, my take would be it's an exaggeration, because they have to keep things going and make it look like the system is still delivering. So I would go for the conservative estimate.
Good. I managed to pin them down on your behalf. But let's move to a separate aspect of what's happening domestically in China. And if you look at the last 4.5 years, you'll see that, and both of you have been studying this more than I have been, that there's been a lot of turmoil within the Chinese military. And in fact, a number of high-ranked military leaders of China have been punished, knocked out, moved against by Xi Jinping. Not only the head of the rocket forces a year back, but also now a second defense minister of China may be in trouble. So what's happening in the Chinese military? What is Xi Jinping worried about? Why is he knocking out one general after another? And what is it that he wants, and what is it that the Chinese military is not being able to deliver?
I think there is a bit of normally people say Xi Jinping has eliminated all the factions and he's totally in control. But I think there is still an internal debate as to how to approach the US, how to approach the great power competition with the US, and in major theaters. For them, as you know, the primary focus is Taiwan and South China Sea, and then secondarily Indian Ocean, and they have this two ocean strategy. So some of the shake-up I attribute to differences of opinion about overall strategy and how much to press the accelerator. This so-called major country diplomacy and the idea that now China's time has come to assert and to push and to expand and to impose its will. So I think on that front, there may be, we don't know, it's like a parlor game and we don't really know what's going on behind the bamboo curtain. So one guess is that. And then secondly, I think there's still, power struggles and attempts to, and he's quite paranoid from what we can see. And I think he's still trying to stamp out any potential dissent or any opposition. And sometimes some of these so-called disciplinary actions in the name of corruption and other things may also, hide political vendettas and such things. They're very vicious. Marxist-Leninism, you don't give quarters. There's no half measures, right? You go for it and you use force and you use violence in order to consolidate power. So to that extent, it's quite a Hobbesian kind of a state, nasty and brutish out there, or Leviathan kind of a state, So I think that may be related to this. But I also wonder why the Western Theatre Command, Vijay may be studying these, why they frequently, the standoff we had with them over 4 years, which has just about started being resolved, even their core commanders were being repeatedly fired or transferred. So something is afoot, and it may be internal politics or also having to do with strategy. That's my guess. Frankly, these kind of states, only insiders can tell what's happening.
Thank you. I just want to add that just to take a step back and to explain the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the military there. In the case of India, the Indian army is not loyal to any political party in India. It's loyal to the constitution and the state, irrespective of which party comes to power. But in the case of China, it is written into the constitution that the army belongs to the Chinese Communist Party. So it's a very strange situation where in a major parade, the party's flag precedes the army's flag. Now, where the armed wing is necessary to maintain power in the state, there is always a suspicion by the political leadership that the military is likely to subvert it. And I would understand that kind of a sentiment if I were living in that country and if I were, say, a Communist Party leader. I think what is interesting in the current situation, however, is that 12 years after he has seized power, practically everybody in government is his appointee. And therefore, if he still feels the need to purge 2 defense ministers, and a third is actually now under investigation, and several senior ranking military officers, then it says something for his internal control, his ability to control the situation internally, because one would have thought that by now he would have vetted people well enough to know who was loyal and who was not. And therefore, I would second Dr. Chaulia's sense that perhaps behind that bamboo curtain, all is not well. Now, we need not jump to the conclusion that there's immediately going to be some coup attempt against Xi Jinping. I don't think that's the case. But what is a fact perhaps is that what appears on the surface to be a monolithic or unitary party or a state is not the case. There are pockets of opposition, and as the man grows older and doesn't appoint a successor, there is a great likelihood of a power struggle leading to political paralysis and perhaps even economic paralysis in the country.
Let's move to the India-China situation, and especially over the last 4.5 years, it has been characterized and defined. India-China relations have been based on what happened in eastern Ladakh in the summer of 2020, when the Chinese moved 2 divisions of troops to areas very close to the LAC or at the LAC itself. Now, after that, the government of India took a very strong stand that if the border can't be peaceful, then the rest of the relationship will be negatively impacted. And in fact, India took a number of very bold measures and steps apart from the military measures. They took a number of bold measures and steps like banning Chinese companies from participating in our telecom 5G rollout, which means that there are implications for 6G, 7G, etc. Chinese companies will not be able to participate in that telecom industry in India anymore. They also banned a number of apps and so on and so forth. But I think what has been the main characteristic of the last 4.5 years is the strong position, consistent position taken by the government of India that if there's no peace on the border, there can be no normalcy in the rest of the relationship. And that has, I think, paid dividends, apart from, of course, the military measures that India took, where we immediately ramped up our military facing the Chinese PLA and stood firm and also did things like the Kailash range action, etc., etc. Now, a question to you both is, now that there has been some relaxation on the military side on the border, that there has been a disengagement of forces, even though there's been no de-escalation of forces, how do you predict and what do you think and how do you recommend the government of India to move forward in its relationship with China?
Firstly, I think the government has to be commended for what it has achieved. I think a consistency of messaging to the Chinese side was able to get results, and the fact that we were willing to hold the larger relationship hostage to the situation that they had created on the border convinced them that unless they in some manner resolve this, they were not going to move ahead. And moving ahead was important both because we are a substantial market today, and that's important for China, but also because with a new president taking office in the United States, there was a concern that you can't actually deal with too many adversaries at the same time. That having been said, I think, at least in my mind, I'm clear that the Chinese still believe that they are able to engage in grey zone warfare with us without any possibility of serious backlash, and that this is a convenient way of keeping us down without risking more wider conflict. So I think the strategy which the government has followed in the last 4 years should be continued, which is you have to keep talking to them and you have to build deterrence along the border as well as in other areas, broader areas like the cyber world, because they are they have the capability to knock out your power grid or paralyze your financial systems and so on. And I think that is government strategy. It means, of course, we are going to have to pay a lot more of our income tax for defense. But given the situation, we have a superpower on our border. I think we have to pay that price in the short term in order to be safe in the long term.
Yeah, I'll just add one more dimension. Apart from the bilateral equation, for given the asymmetry and we are still catching up with them, we obviously rely on major strategic partnerships. My new book, Friends, is about our 7 closest strategic partners. And I find that the counterbalancing of China is very much an element in all our major strategic partnerships. So you all know about the Quad formation, for example, but there may even one-on-one bilateral in the Indo-Pacific. So this dimension is essentially a structural and ingrained one because of the power asymmetry. And I don't think that we can afford to relax the counterbalancing, effort, because we would not want a Sino-centric regional order to come about. So I think, especially with the Quad partner, but also with Vietnam, with Indonesia, I think there are some pivotal countries in the region with whom we will continue to ramp up. So, and for the Chinese, they see all that, It's not just about the LAC situation or about the, the unsettled border issue. It's ultimately for them, it's about, is India part of some big containment strategy? And so there, I think, if we the government policy has been that we are now much more, we have moved beyond hedging, as our External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar says. So there's no question of non-alignment. I don't buy that at all. It's just a non-starter in today's era. The United States is not threatening our territorial integrity. United States is not trying to impede our rise as an Indo-Pacific power. We have problems with them, but there's no question of that. So my view is that the closer we align with the US and with the rest of the partners, the Chinese will try to apply, pressure on us on the border and through other means. So I think we cannot make concessions, on this front, on our autonomy and our freedom and our own ambition to be their equal. How can we become their equal if we are not involved in counterbalancing? So I think it's going to be very critical that we also maintain that policy going forward. There was a time when people said India is the weak link in Quad, and we use it as a bargaining chip to the Chinese, saying, okay, if we settle some things with you, then we will not go too close to the US. I think that era is over. So I think we are very clear. We do see this as an adversary in some form or the other, although people say we don't officially or declare this as an adversary. But effectively, we are working towards that, and that multi-alignment strategy to maintain balance will maintain the friction also. There's a degree of friction with China which cannot be overcome. Audience would know 2005, sir, both of you were in service, we actually signed a strategic partnership with China, and that has effectively lapsed. There's no way China can be a strategic partner or friend of India given these structural dynamics.
Let's talk a little bit about the military aspect, because last 4.5 years the Indian military did rise to the occasion, to the challenges in eastern Ladakh, but there is this great move in India to have joint military commands, to have jointness of operations. And how far are the Chinese ahead in that? Because they have these strategic commands, as we have spoken about. The Western Command, which is based in Chengdu, is right opposite us. And so how important is it for India to move in the direction of jointness of operations of all its military might, which includes the Air Force, Army and the Navy? So if I could just get a little bit from both of you on this question. How important is it for the Indian military not only to modernize itself as a force, but also to have more jointness of operations?
Yeah, I think it's very, very important. And before I come to jointness, Gautam, let me say that first of all, geography and weather favors the Chinese. On their side, it's a flat plateau. On our side, we have a sharp fall from 16,000 feet to practically zero. So moving up forces, preparing them to acclimatize them takes much longer, costs more for India, and therefore it's much easier for the Chinese to deploy. So they have an operational advantage against us practically all along the line of actual control. Now, in this context, jointness that the Chinese have done means that they have a single command opposite us, all the way from the tip of the Union Territory of Ladakh to the tip of Arunachal Pradesh. We have 3 military commands handling China: Northern Command, Central Command and Eastern Command. So first of all, it's a bit of a difficult coordination, trying to get 3 commands to coordinate a military action which on the other side is coordinated by a single command. Secondly, they have a joint command, so they can actually, the army commander can actually acquire air forces, for instance, and perhaps we don't know, even geospatial forces like space forces, to bring to bear the full weight of their military on us. Whereas in our case, the Air Force operates separately, our Space Command operates separately, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, if we do not unify our command in some way through jointness, it's going to further disadvantage us beyond the geography and the weather. And therefore, I think it's awfully important that we give priority to this.
No, I totally agree. But you know, being a democracy, there's so much consultation with the different wings of the armed forces. The Air Force was opposed to some, theaterization that would, erode their turf, and the Army and the Air Force, especially these two, not so much the Navy. So it's been a long haul, and unfortunately, we lost General Rawat. He was leading the whole effort for integration through an accident. So these things have set us back. But we may be slow, but eventually we'll do it. And I believe Prime Minister Modi in his 3rd term, one of the strategic priorities is to accomplish this goal, because we can't lag, as Vijayji was saying, in terms of preparedness. In terms of the border infrastructure and all, as you know, we are spending a lot more. I would only add that, in overall defense spending also, 1.5 to less than 2% of GDP is not sufficient in the long run because the gap, the strategic gap will widen further, no? Because they officially, Chinese are spending what, 250 billion or what, that's what they claim. But then the Americans say it's much more than what they are officially stating. So if you're spending 70, 80 billion, that's 1/3 of what they're doing, right? So especially in the naval domain, I mean, the kind of shipbuilding they're doing is just incredible, the speed at which they're doing. So if they have 10 aircraft carriers, we are going to be swamped in the Indian Ocean, no? Forget Sri Lanka, forget Maldives, we are going to be in big trouble. So to be able to deter them, we will need to invest a lot more in the overheads also. I mean, there's a long convoluted debate in India as to whether the armed forces are spending whatever is being allocated by the government, and people go round and round in circles. But plain fact, no rising power has become a great power or a leading power in the world over a period of time without spending at least 3 to 4% on GDP per annum. At least 3% is something we should be aspiring for. Right now it's below 2%, and I think that's one area we need to prioritize before the gap worsens.
Let's turn to India's neighborhood, the countries around us. There is this feeling, especially in the popular mind, that all our neighboring countries are slowly, one by one, turning against us. So you can look at Nepal. The recent example of Bangladesh is yet another pointer. So there's this feeling that our neighboring countries are being utilized by another big power to turn against us. What's your take on this? Maybe Professor Chaulia, will start with you and then come to Vijay.
I think, Gautamji, I would say we should not have momentary judgments. We are nowadays being driven by the news cycle 24 hours. Okay, there's a regime change. Suddenly there's a hue and cry. How did we lose this country? In this, and then, this is all momentary, because after 6 months, the structural reality set in. You saw what happened with the Maldives. You started with a regime that claimed to be pro-China and, was, defying India and all that. Ultimately, Muizu made his peace. He came, he realized that the Chinese were not willing to give them what they needed for their, financial stability. So I think even with Bangladesh, of course, much bigger than the Maldives. But what I'm saying is that just because there's a regime change, we should not immediately say that India lost and China won. I think that's a very simplistic and reductionist. We have made efforts to build bridges and to have assets deep in all these societies. We have strong cultural linkages here, and our projects are also running. Even with Taliban takeover in 2021, everyone said it's a big defeat for India and a great victory for Pakistan. Now we know it's our projects are back up and running. I don't think we have ambassadorial level appointment yet, but our embassy is working. We have mid-ranking diplomats running our projects, and touch wood, so far no incidents. And our technicians have all gone back and are doing the work in Afghanistan. So we claw our way back. I mean, even if there is a setback here and there occasionally. So if we take a longer duration view, 10, 20 years, India is always there. I don't think it can be dismissed or dislodged by China. And by the way, with the Chinese slowdown, to connect it to that, their outlays and their ability for the Belt and Road initiatives also are declining. They have done a kind of a internal assessment also of these projects and their financial viability. They're scaling down. So I think eventually with higher growth rates, we can also put more money on the table in these neighboring countries and outcompete the Chinese. At least that is the best case scenario for us.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Chaulia that there are no exclusive backyards anymore. Not for India, not for the United States, not for China either. But on a note of, I think a note of caution here must be stated, and I think you know this, Gautam, you have served in 3 of our neighboring states. The investments we have put into those countries in terms of soft power has noticeably declined. An entire generation of Nepali students are no longer coming to India. An entire generation of Bhutanese students are no longer coming to India. A number of people who used to come for medical treatment from Maldives and Sri Lanka are no longer coming. When you lose such constituencies, you ultimately lose political leverage in that country. And the latest case is the Gurkhas in Nepal. Because of our Agniveer scheme, we are not recruiting Gurkhas anymore. This is a very powerful political constituency in Nepal, and they are dependent on us because pensions are paid by the Indian Army. If we don't recruit Gurkhas in another 20 years, that constituency will be lost. And once you lose the constituencies like that, public opinion in the country turns against you. So while I agree with you, Dr. Chaulia, I think we are being a little too complacent. We need to ramp up our game in terms of attracting certain key constituencies. The youth in these countries, we need to invest in the security forces of these countries. I don't mean put money there, but we need to train the Nepal police. Today, who is training them? China is. We need to train the military in these countries. If we don't build those constituencies, I suspect we will run into a problem in our neighborhood sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much. I think we've been speaking for quite some time, and I'd like to bring the conversation to an end. We don't want to labor the China angle. We want to leave you with some takeaways, which I think you already have. But one last question from my side to both the gentlemen, and then maybe if there are any questions from the floor, we can ask the questions from the floor. But I wrote a book called Rising to the China Challenge. What is it that India should be doing? We're looking at India domestically, internally. What is it that India should be doing to be able to rise to the China challenge, not just militarily, but also more importantly, geopolitically or geostrategically? So maybe Vijay first and then Professor Chaulia.
I have just one word answer: technology. If we can't develop technology, we aren't going to compete in the world either with China or with the United States. We'll just be a market like we were for Britain in the 19th century.
Yeah, I think reducing dependence for critical ingredients in key sectors of our economy, I think we need to, the Western countries talking about de-risking. Whether we call it decoupling, de-risking, whatever, there's like a polemics around that. I would say we need to look for alternatives. And there's good research showing that actually 75% of what we are importing from China can be sourced from other countries or can be made domestically if we have make a strategic effort at reducing dependence. And that will probably give us more confidence to deal with them, because there's always the hidden fear of blackmail, right? If they deny us ingredients, then where do we go, for our economy to go forward? So I think we have to think about the supply chains and the value chains and how to move away from the Sino-centric supply chains and how to build alternatives. And that is going to be, I think, one of the tests of our long-term strategy vis-a-vis China.
I saw some hands up amongst the audience, so if we could get some questions from the audience, we'll take those, and we'll take them in groups of 3. So yes, sir, please go ahead.
Hello, sir. My question is, I just want to know the fall of China, because everybody thought that after British Empire and US, who has been ruling the world, it would be China for substantial years. But was their model always to fall? Because is it an ideological problem, or is it a problem of trying to do multiple things? And I will substantiate it. Ideological problem means they want to have this something called a socialist democracy, but where their elections don't happen, but they still want to rule the world through the capitalist route, because they want someone sitting in a village should know what is the market. But there is still a kind of a because of their because they don't have a democracy per se, it's very difficult to connect with the people because their Twitter was not working or whatever. And are they trying to do a lot of things? Because there was time when gold used to rule the world. When there was time that when you have land used to rule the world. Whoever will have more land will rule the world. Right now, with data also you can rule, but they still have the expansionist attitude with.
So can we have the question?
Yeah.
Please?
So I just want to know, is it because of that expansionist attitude as well? Because they are not just in India, but also in Sri Lanka as well as Africa. So was this model always to fall? Should we be surprised with it, or it was always to happen?
The lady there, please.
This is basically with Rajas, I always have a lot of discussion on how mighty is China. And I always like to read the press and all the papers. I know China closely. I have visited, done joint papers with their academics. And I feel it's a very vast and great country. We have to give them that. And I say that, and I get super excited when, we say fall of China and China in trouble. But he says, no, China has deep pockets. It can bring the US economy down any moment because of the ADRs, the kind of money that they have put into the US. US is propped up, is what Rajas Partsure always says. And I have this. So what do you think? One. And two, regarding the insider story of why they keep denying us the UN Security Council, so we don't want to go by, at least I don't.
Okay.
I want to know the real story.
Thank you. I'll accept two questions. There should be only one, but I'll accept two questions from you.
My name is Christian Preinfalk. I have lived in China for more than 2.5 years. One thing I miss over here, and that's why I want to ask, you completely neglect the BRICS situation, because I agree with a lot of things you said. I would have some points of discussion, but you completely did not talk about the BRICS situation, which is a little bit strange. And I want to ask, what's your opinion about the situation from the alternative from the south towards the Western hemisphere, BRICS against US?
Let me, before I hand the floor to the two gentlemen, because they may want to talk about BRICS, but I must share with you that I didn't ask anything about BRICS because that is what I think about it. So I don't give it any importance at all, and therefore I stayed away from asking them about BRICS, but they may not agree with me. So let me hand the floor to both of them, maybe Vijay first and Sreeram after that. If you can take all three or maybe four questions.
So I'll be brief. I don't think China is expansionist in the way that the West was. They are not looking for territory. They're looking to bind the world's economy to themselves, and they have been partially successful at that, and that's their mode of growing their influence. So I don't think that if we hope for the coming collapse of China, I think we'll have to wait till the cows come home, frankly. I don't agree with you, ma'am, that China has a one-way lever over the United States. It's mutually assured destruction. $1.3 trillion in treasury securities, if they pull back, the dollar will collapse, which means it won't be $1.3 trillion. By the time they get the money in their hands, it will be $200 billion, right? Plus, they will have lost the biggest market they have. So America has as much of a trigger to self-destruct in bringing China as China has a trigger to self-destruct in bringing down the United States. As far as BRICS is concerned, sir, if you remove China from the equation and calculate the total economic size of the others, we don't matter in the rest of the world. So let us not pretend that BRICS is an alternative to the G7. Until we get to a $10 trillion economy, BRICS is China. And India will not allow China its say everywhere. So our job at BRICS at the moment is to ensure that we keep BRICS more neutral than tilting towards the Russia-China axis. But we should be under no illusion that we can at this stage fundamentally influence China in BRICS. Its economy is 10 times bigger than the rest of the 10 countries put together in that group.
Yeah, I'll just respond to BRICS also. See, I have written a journal article 3 years ago arguing that what we are doing there in BRICS, India, is actually internal balancing to prevent a Chinese takeover. Even with the expansion of with the new members, 5 to 6 new countries are coming in as members, our effort has been to prevent this institution from being hijacked by China. So there's a kind of an internal balancing act that we're doing, and we will remain part of BRICS for that reason. Not because we believe in a de-dollarization or in some kind of an alternative world order or to challenge the West. Increasingly, what we want from BRICS is to make sure that it is balanced and to make sure it is doing pragmatic cooperation for the benefit of all the members. That's all. We don't want it to become an ideological vehicle to do a crusade against the US or against Europe. So I think our position is based on our own national interests and our own long-term rise, which cannot be achieved through BRICS. And BRICS, we used to be enthusiastic about BRICS in the pre-Xi Jinping period, when the conflict and the confrontation with China was not as pronounced. But now increasingly there is a feeling that it doesn't achieve so much of our strategic goals. So I would say, for example, although it's not a good parallel, Quad is far more important for us than BRICS. And we have other plurilateral and trilateral and minilateral groupings in which we are part of now. So for example, France, UAE, India, Australia, Indonesia, India, Japan, Australia, India. So there are so many other, what we call the variable geometry, and we are more invested in those kinds of groupings than in BRICS. But we will not leave BRICS because we can't leave the field for it to become another vehicle by which China can shoot at the West and where we are being marginalized. So we will be there, and we will work along with all our like-minded partners to ensure that BRICS does not become hijacked or does not turn into an ideological talking shop, because then it is of no use to any of the members.